Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The calm before the storm. Dr. Vanessa Jackson stood in the quiet confines of her living room, the soft hum of the city outside serving as a faint backdrop to her thoughts. The room, filled with modern furniture and carefully curated artwork, reflected the life she had built, meticulous, successful, and undeniably lonely. As one of the leading cardiothoracic surgeons in the country, Vanessa's career was nothing short of extraordinary. She had worked tirelessly to get to where she was, shattering glass ceilings and navigating the treacherous waters of a profession dominated by white men. Her morning had started like any other, a brisk workout, a nutrient-packed smoothie, and a quick review of the cases waiting for her back at the hospital in New York. This flight from San Francisco to New York was supposed to be a brief reprieve, a few hours of solitude before diving back into the chaos of operating rooms and patient consultations. Vanessa was no stranger to first-class cabins. They were a well-deserved indulgence, a small comfort amidst a career that demanded so much of her. As she approached the terminal, her phone buzzed with a message from her younger brother, Marcus. "Don't work too hard, sis. Life's too short for that. Remember to breathe once in a while." Vanessa smiled. Marcus, an architect living in Chicago, had always been her anchor. His reminders to live beyond her career often felt like gentle nudges to reconnect with the world outside of her work. She replied with a quick, "I hear you, Marcus. Love you." The boarding process was seamless. The familiar routine of stowing her carry-on, settling into her window seat, and pulling out her tablet gave her a sense of control, a stark contrast to the unpredictability of her work. She noticed the flight attendants exchanging glances and offering her warm smiles. Vanessa had flown with this airline enough times to be recognized by the staff, some of whom even addressed her by name. As the plane began to taxi, Vanessa opened her tablet to review her notes for an upcoming medical conference. But her thoughts kept drifting to her most recent surgery, a complex case involving a young child whose heart condition had been deemed inoperable by others. The successful outcome of that procedure had reinforced her belief in the power of perseverance and innovation. Despite her professional accomplishments, there was a quiet yearning in Vanessa's heart, one she rarely acknowledged. Her life, while fulfilling in many ways, felt incomplete. The long hours and emotional toll of her work left little room for personal connections. Her mother, a retired teacher, often reminded her that success was hollow if you had no one to share it with. Vanessa glanced out the window as the plane ascended, the sprawling city below shrinking into a patchwork of lights. She closed her eyes and let the hum of the engines lull her into a meditative state. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of calm. That calm, however, was short-lived. About an hour into the flight, as the attendants moved through the cabin with drinks and snacks, Vanessa noticed a white woman in her mid-50s seated diagonally across the aisle. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, the woman exuded an air of entitlement. Vanessa didn't think much of it, she was used to sharing first class with corporate executives and business travelers. But then, the woman's gaze lingered on Vanessa, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to something harsher. Vanessa ignored it at first, assuming it was just one of those moments where someone stares too long, without realizing it. But when the woman leaned over and whispered something to the flight attendant, her suspicions grew. Minutes later, the flight attendant approached Vanessa with a hesitant expression. "Dr. Jackson, I hate to bother you, but there's been a concern raised by one of the passengers." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "A concern?" The attendant nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "The passenger in seat 3C claims you might not belong in this section." Vanessa blinked, stunned by the absurdity of the statement. She took a deep breath, her years of dealing with subtle and overt racism preparing her for moments like this. "I'm sorry, but what exactly is the concern?" "My boarding pass clearly states this is my seat." The attendant nodded again, this time with an apologetic look. "I know, Dr. Jackson. We're just trying to address the issue without escalating it." Vanessa glanced at the woman in 3C, who was now watching the interaction with an air of self-satisfaction. The audacity of the situation was infuriating, but Vanessa knew better than to let her emotions take over. Calmly, she reached into her bag, pulled out her boarding pass, and handed it to the attendant. "Feel free to double-check." The attendant examined the pass, her face softening with relief. "Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I'll handle this." But before the attendant could walk away, the woman in 3C interjected. "I don't care what her boarding pass says," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I've flown first class for years, and I know when someone doesn't belong." The cabin fell silent. Passengers turned to watch the unfolding drama, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Vanessa stood up, her composure unwavering. She looked directly at the woman, her voice steady but firm. "And what exactly about me suggests that I don't belong here?" The woman faltered for a moment but quickly regained her composure. "I just think it's odd, that's all. People like you don't usually fly first class." The implication was clear, and it hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Vanessa felt the weight of every microaggression she'd ever endured pressing down on her. But instead of letting it crush her, she channeled that energy into strength. "I'm Dr. Vanessa Jackson, a cardiothoracic surgeon. I've earned every bit of the success that allows me to sit in this seat. The question isn't whether I belong here. It's why you think you have the right to question me." The woman's face turned red, her confidence visibly shaken. Before she could respond, another passenger, a middle-aged man in a business suit, chimed in. She showed her boarding pass. "This conversation should be over," he said, his tone firm. Several other passengers murmured their agreement. The flight attendant, sensing the growing tension, stepped in. "Ma'am," she said to the woman in 3C, "Dr. Jackson is in the correct seat. If you have any further concerns, I suggest you take them up with the airline after we land." The woman huffed and sank back into her seat, her indignation replaced by embarrassment. As Vanessa sat back down, she felt a mix of emotions, anger, exhaustion, and a faint sense of vindication. The murmurs in the cabin gradually subsided, and the flight attendants resumed their duties. But the incident had left a mark, not just on Vanessa, but on everyone who had witnessed it. For Vanessa, it was a stark reminder of the battles she still had to fight, even as a successful Black woman in one of the most respected professions. For the other passengers, it was an uncomfortable glimpse into the reality of prejudice and the quiet strength it takes to confront it. As the plane continued its journey, Vanessa closed her eyes again, this time not to relax, but to reflect. This was not the first time she had been made to prove herself, and it wouldn't be the last. But in that moment, she resolved to use her voice, her platform, and her story to challenge the biases that still pervaded her world. And so, the calm before the storm gave way to a new kind of resolve, one that would change not only the course of her flight but perhaps the course of her life. Ripples in the air. The hum of the airplane engine seemed louder now, filling the cabin with a tangible tension as Vanessa leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes that had witnessed the confrontation, some curious, some sympathetic, and others wary. Vanessa was used to moments like this. They were woven into her life as seamlessly as the years of medical training that had brought her to this point. As an African-American woman navigating a male-dominated profession, moments of doubt and microaggressions had become part of her reality. But it never got easier. No matter how successful she became, how many accolades she earned, or how many lives she saved, there always seemed to be someone questioning her place. She sighed deeply, stealing a glance across the aisle. The woman in 3C, now visibly uncomfortable, was pretending to be absorbed in a book she hadn't turned a page of since takeoff. A small, hollow satisfaction flickered inside Vanessa. Justice had been served, if only for a fleeting moment. But was it really justice? Vanessa's thoughts lingered on the incident. The confrontation had been brief, but the ripples it created stretched far beyond the small confines of the first-class cabin. It wasn't just about her seat. It was about the assumptions, the stereotypes, the insidious whispers of doubt that clung to women like her, Women who dared to defy expectations and occupy spaces that others believed were not theirs to claim. "Would you like something to drink, Dr. Jackson?" The flight attendant's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. She glanced up and managed a polite smile. "Just water, thank you." As the attendant disappeared down the aisle, Vanessa noticed the businessman seated to her right, the one who had spoken up earlier, tilt slightly toward her. "Some people just don't know when to mind their own business," he said softly, his tone casual but firm. "I'm glad you put her in her place." Vanessa turned to look at him, studying his face for a moment. He looked to be in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and a crisp navy suit. He wore an expression of genuine concern, but his words didn't sit quite right with her. "Put her in her place," she echoed. He shrugged. "I mean, you handled it well. I've seen plenty of people lose their cool in situations like that." Vanessa forced a tight smile and nodded politely, but her mind turned over his words like a stone in her hand. There was something unsettling about the phrase, something that implied the incident was about winning, about proving dominance. But for Vanessa, it wasn't about that at all. It wasn't about putting anyone in their place, it was about standing her ground, about asserting the truth of her existence in a world that sometimes refused to see it. She shifted in her seat and opened her tablet again, hoping to find distraction in her notes. But the words on the screen blurred as her mind wandered back to the woman in 3C. Who was she, really? What made her so certain that Vanessa didn't belong? Vanessa remembered her mother's words from years ago. When people don't know you, they'll fill in the blanks themselves. And more often than not, they'll fill them with things that make sense to them, not the truth. Her mother had always been wise, a quiet force of nature who'd raised Vanessa and her brother, Marcus, on her own. Vanessa admired her mother's strength, but she'd also watched her endure the subtle humiliations of a world that refused to see her worth. As a child, Vanessa hadn't understood why her mother swallowed her anger, why she smiled politely at rude comments or brushed off stares in department stores. But now, as a grown woman, she understood. Her mother had chosen survival over confrontation. She had chosen her children's safety and her own dignity. But Vanessa was not her mother. She would not endure in silence. The flight attendant returned with Vanessa's glass of water, and as she accepted it, a faint voice broke through the quiet hum of the cabin. "I really don't understand what the big deal was." Vanessa looked up to see that the woman in 3C was now speaking to her seatmate, a man in his early 30s with dark hair and a weary expression. The woman's voice was low, but her words carried through the still air of the cabin like poison. "Don't you think she overreacted? It's not like I accused her of anything serious. I just thought it was suspicious, that's all. Can you blame me for being cautious these days?" Vanessa's grip on the glass tightened. She had hoped the incident was over, buried in the awkward silence of the cabin. But this was something else. The woman wasn't just apologetic, she was defiant. The businessman to Vanessa's right stiffened as he overheard the exchange, shooting Vanessa a glance as if to gauge her reaction. But Vanessa didn't react, not yet. She took a long sip of her water, centering herself. In moments like this, Vanessa thought of the operating room. There, everything was precise, controlled, and calculated. Life and death were often decided by the steadiness of her hands, the clarity of her thoughts. She couldn't afford to let emotion cloud her judgment. That same composure had served her well in life outside the hospital, even when faced with moments like this. But the murmurs didn't stop. The woman's words seemed to sink into the space around her, infecting it with doubt. Vanessa could feel the temperature in the cabin shift, the energy becoming thick and uncomfortable. It was then that Vanessa did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She stood up. The sudden movement startled the businessman beside her and drew the eyes of nearly every passenger in the cabin. Vanessa turned slowly to face the woman in 3C, her expression unreadable, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," she said. "I couldn't help but overhear." The woman looked up, her face pale, but defiant. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for you to hear that." Vanessa shook her head. No, I think you did. You were speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. The cabin fell utterly silent. Vanessa could feel the weight of every gaze, every breath held in anticipation. I'd like to address something, Vanessa continued, her voice ringing out clear and strong. You don't know me. You don't know my story, my accomplishments, or the road I've traveled to sit in this seat. And yet, you made an assumption about me, a dangerous, ignorant assumption, based solely on the color of my skin. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze darting around the cabin for support. But no one spoke up. Vanessa pressed on. What bothers me most isn't just that you questioned my right to be here, it's that you still don't see what's wrong with what you did. You're still trying to justify it, to paint yourself as cautious rather than prejudiced. And that's the problem. The woman opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. I don't need your apology, Vanessa said, her tone softer now. I don't need you to admit you were wrong. But I hope this moment makes you think twice the next time you look at someone and decide, without knowing them, that they don't belong. The silence that followed was deafening. No one clapped this time. There were no murmurs of admiration, no rounds of applause. And that was exactly how Vanessa wanted it. She sat back down, her hand steady, her heart calm. The woman in 3C said nothing else for the remainder of the flight. The cabin remained quiet, the tension slowly dissolving into an air of reflection. For the first time in a long while, Vanessa didn't feel like she was fighting to be seen. She had spoken her truth, not for the approval of others, but for herself. As she looked out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, she felt something shift within her. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about claiming her space in the world, unapologetically and without compromise. And in that moment, the quiet hum of the engines no longer sounded like tension. It sounded like freedom. Beneath the surface, the faint hum of the engines had settled into a rhythmic background noise, but for Vanessa, the calm in the first-class cabin felt deceptive, like the silence before a storm. She turned her head slightly, catching the movement of the woman in seat 3C out of the corner of her eye. The woman's embarrassment had given way to silence, though Vanessa could feel her glare as a steady weight against her back. It wasn't just about the seat or the accusation anymore. The interaction had stirred something deep within Vanessa, an old wound she thought had long been covered by the armor of her success. But that armor, no matter how carefully crafted, always seemed to show cracks when it mattered most. Her phone buzzed faintly in her bag. She checked the message briefly. Marcus, you landed yet? Let me know when you get there. I worry about you, sis. Vanessa smiled softly at her brother's message. Marcus, despite his laid-back demeanor, had always been the one to look out for her. It was a role he had adopted after their father's untimely passing when Vanessa was just 10 years old. Back then, her world had felt small and fragile, held together only by her mother's quiet strength and Marcus's playful insistence that everything would be okay. She typed a quick response. Still flying. Long story. I'll call you later. As she slipped the phone back into her bag, Vanessa's mind wandered back to her childhood. She could almost hear her mother's voice, patient yet firm, as she taught Vanessa and Marcus the value of hard work and resilience. You're going to have to work twice as hard to prove yourself, her mother would say. It's not fair, but it's the way of the world. And I know you're strong enough to handle it. At 10 years old, Vanessa hadn't fully understood what her mother meant. Back then, working twice as hard had seemed like a simple challenge, one she could overcome with a little extra effort. But as she grew older, the reality of those words became undeniable. She saw it in the dismissive stares during medical school, the skeptical glances from colleagues when she first scrubbed into an operating room, and the questions that often hovered unspoken in the air. Are you sure she belongs here? The confrontation with the woman in 3C was nothing new. It was a reflection of the same old narrative, a narrative Vanessa had spent her entire life dismantling. But today, for some reason, it stung more deeply than usual. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the weight of always having to prove herself. Or maybe it was because she hadn't realized just how much she still carried with her. A shared story. "Excuse me, Dr. Jackson." The businessman to her right, the one who had spoken earlier in her defense, turned to her again. His voice was calm, careful, as though he were approaching a fragile subject. "I hope I'm not bothering you." Vanessa turned slightly toward him, offering a small smile. "Not at all." "I'm sorry, I don't think I caught your name." "Greg. Greg Hunter." He extended a hand, which Vanessa shook politely. I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. I wanted to say I'm sorry you had to go through that." Vanessa nodded, though her smile was tinged with wariness. She appreciated the support, but apologies like Greg's always left her conflicted. They were well-intentioned, but they also reminded her of how common these situations were, how they always seemed to require someone else to validate her position. "It's fine," Vanessa replied evenly, her tone measured. "It's not the first time something like that has happened, and unfortunately, it probably won't be the last." Greg frowned, as though struggling to find the right words. "That doesn't make it okay. You shouldn't have to deal with that." "Life rarely gives us what we should get," Vanessa said with a soft shrug. "It gives us what we fight for." Greg's gaze lingered on her for a moment, studying her expression. "You're stronger than most people I know, Dr. Jackson. It's a shame that people like her," he gestured subtly toward 3C, "can't see that strength right away." Vanessa's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The problem isn't that she doesn't see my strength. It's that she doesn't believe it exists." The silence between them settled briefly before Greg broke it. "You're a surgeon, right? You mentioned that earlier." Vanessa nodded. "Cardiothoracic. I specialize in complex heart surgeries." Greg let out a low whistle of admiration. "Impressive. That's not a small feat. You must love what you do." "I do," Vanessa said softly. "But it's not easy." "No, I can imagine it isn't." Greg's tone grew quieter, as though he were shifting gears. "My father was a doctor, a general practitioner in Chicago. He used to tell me that being a good doctor requires more than just skill. It requires heart. You look like someone who knows both sides of that equation." Vanessa glanced at him, surprised by the unexpected depth of his words. For a moment, she saw something familiar in his eyes, an understanding that ran deeper than the small talk they had shared so far. "My mother used to say something similar," Vanessa replied, her voice soft. "She taught me that no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't let the world define me. I had to define myself. It's what got me through medical school, through my residency, and through the moments when I felt like I didn't belong." Greg nodded slowly. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Vanessa agreed. "Still is. And she was right. I wouldn't be where I am today if I'd let other people's doubts dictate my life." Greg smiled faintly, as though he recognized the weight of her words. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. People like you change lives in ways most of us can't even imagine." Vanessa inclined her head in gratitude, though Greg's words lingered with her longer than she expected. She had heard praise before. Countless times from patients, colleagues, and medical students. But this was different. There was something grounding about it, something that reminded her that her fight to claim her place in the world wasn't just for herself. It was for the people who needed to see her succeed. A sudden realization. As the flight progressed, Vanessa felt her body relax slightly, though her mind remained restless. She picked up the medical journal she had brought with her, skimming through the latest articles on surgical advancements. But the words blurred together, her thoughts drifting back to the interaction with the woman in 3C. Why had it shaken her so much? For years, Vanessa had trained herself to brush off microaggressions. She had grown adept at wearing her armor, her cool demeanor, her impeccable professionalism, and her unshakable focus. She had always believed that success was the ultimate answer to doubt. But now, she wasn't so sure. She set the journal down and leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The memory of her younger self, bright-eyed, eager, and untested, rose in her mind. That version of Vanessa had believed that excellence would shield her from prejudice. That if she worked hard enough, earned enough accolades, and proved herself beyond all doubt, the world would accept her. But the truth was more complicated. Success had opened doors for her, but it hadn't erased the assumptions people made about her before she even spoke. The woman in 3C was proof of that. The realization was both painful and liberating. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself, but maybe the fight wasn't about proving her worth to others. Maybe it was about holding on to her belief in herself, even when others doubted her. Vanessa opened her eyes, staring out at the vast stretch of sky beyond the airplane window. The clouds drifted lazily below, unbothered by the chaos of the world beneath them. In that moment, Vanessa felt something shift inside her, an acceptance she hadn't known she needed. She didn't need the woman in 3C to believe in her. She didn't need anyone to validate her presence. She belonged, on this plane, in her career, and in the spaces she had fought so hard to claim. And no one could take that from her. The hum of the engines carried her thoughts forward, toward a realization that would change the way she saw herself, her work, and her place in the world. For Vanessa, the flight was no longer just a journey between cities. It was a journey back to herself. A new altitude. The plane's engines droned on, steady and unchanging, but inside Vanessa, the air felt electric, charged with something that had been building for a long time. For all her carefully maintained composure and controlled responses, the confrontation with the woman in seat 3C had scraped against an old wound. It wasn't just about her seat or the cabin, it was about the quiet, unseen wars she'd fought every day to earn her place. Her eyes wandered out the window again, watching the sunlight gleam off the endless stretch of clouds. What am I still fighting for? She wondered. The question rattled in her mind like a loose screw, uncomfortable, but impossible to ignore. She'd climbed mountains in her career, shattered expectations, and proven herself time and again, yet here she was, still bristling at the idea that anyone could question her right to exist in spaces she had earned. The tension of it lingered in her chest, heavy and unsettling. It wasn't just about Susan, the woman in 3C, or even the incident itself. It was about Vanessa. Her drive, her sacrifices, her endless quest for success. And now, after all she had achieved, the price of it all was staring her in the face. Conversations that matter. Dr. Jackson? The familiar voice of the flight attendant startled her out of her thoughts. Vanessa turned, offering a polite smile as the attendant approached. It was the same woman who had recognized her earlier, Linda, her name tag read. I just wanted to check in and see if you need anything else, Linda said softly. Then, after a pause, she added, I also wanted to apologize, for earlier. On behalf of all of us. You didn't deserve that. Vanessa regarded Linda for a moment, searching her face for any sign of condescension or pity. Instead, all she saw was sincerity. It's not your fault, Vanessa replied, her voice even. Unfortunately, it's something I'm used to. Linda nodded, her eyes glistening faintly as though she had something more to say. Can I share something with you? Of course. Linda glanced toward the back of the cabin, ensuring no one needed her attention, before sitting briefly in the empty seat across the aisle. When I was younger, my mother was a nurse in a small-town hospital. She used to tell me stories about the few black doctors who passed through there. She said they had to work twice as hard to get half as much credit. Vanessa's chest tightened as she listened. Linda continued, her voice soft but steady. When my daughter got sick a couple of years ago, she had a rare heart condition. None of the local doctors could figure out how to save her, but the hospital brought in a specialist from San Francisco. That specialist was you. I didn't get to thank you in person then, but I remember watching you walk into the room, so calm and in control. You didn't just save my daughter, you gave me hope. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, the weight of Linda's words settling over her like a blanket. I didn't realize. I didn't say anything earlier because I didn't want to embarrass you, Linda admitted. But I thought you should know. Moments like today, people questioning you, doubting you, they don't define you. The lives you've touched, the hope you give people like me, that's what defines you. Vanessa looked at Linda, feeling the heat rise behind her eyes. She blinked it back, offering a small but genuine smile. Thank you for telling me that. Linda smiled warmly, her expression softening as she stood. You belong here, Dr. Jackson. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise. As Linda walked back toward the galley, Vanessa sat still, processing her words. You belong here. She exhaled slowly, letting the phrase settle into the cracks she hadn't realized were there. For so long, Vanessa had measured her worth against the bar others set for her. Her achievements, her accolades, they were all proof that she deserved her place in the world. But hearing it now, spoken so simply and sincerely, was like a balm she hadn't known she needed. The long reflection. Vanessa's gaze drifted back to the cabin. Most of the passengers were immersed in their own worlds, typing away on laptops, scrolling through phones, or resting under blankets. The woman in 3C, Susan, had sunk into her seat, her gaze fixed on the back of the headrest. Her posture was rigid, the tension from earlier still clinging to her like an unwelcome shadow. Vanessa considered confronting her again, this time with less restraint. She could have said more, about the assumptions Susan made, about the audacity it took to question a stranger's right to occupy a space. But what would it accomplish? Susan's perspective wasn't Vanessa's responsibility to fix. Vanessa opened her bag and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. It was a habit she had picked up during medical school, writing down her thoughts in moments when everything felt too overwhelming. She flipped to a blank page and let the pen hover for a moment before she began to write. June 3, 2024. Sometimes, I wonder how much of my life has been spent proving myself to others. Today, a stranger questioned my right to sit in a first-class seat. The truth is, I've been questioned my whole life, silently and sometimes loudly. And every time, I've fought back with hard work, success, and quiet defiance. But when does it end? When do I get to exist without justifying my place? Today, someone reminded me that my worth doesn't come from the doubt others cast on me, it comes from the hope I've given and the lives I've touched. She paused, staring at the words on the page as though they might rearrange themselves into something more profound. The memories of her patients, their families, and their gratitude flashed through her mind like scenes from an old film reel. She thought of the children whose hearts she had mended, the mothers who had clutched her hands in relief, the fathers who had cried silently in hospital waiting rooms. Her work wasn't just about skill or perfection, it was about people. It was about giving hope where there had been none. And that was something no one could take from her. Vanessa closed the journal, sliding it back into her bag. The fog that had clouded her mind since takeoff felt lighter now. She no longer felt the need to relitigate the encounter with Susan or stew over its implications. The doubt wasn't hers to carry. Shifting tides. As the plane continued its journey eastward, Vanessa felt herself settling into a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. It was as though the confrontation had cracked open a door she'd kept locked for too long, a door to a part of herself she had been ignoring. Greg, the businessman beside her, leaned over slightly. Are you okay? Vanessa glanced at him, surprised by the question. She considered brushing it off, offering the usual I'm fine, but something stopped her. I think so, she said finally. I'm just reflecting on everything. Greg nodded, as though he understood. People like Susan, don't waste your energy on them. You've got more important things to do. Vanessa smiled faintly. You're right. I do. And for the first time in a long while, she truly believed it. The hum of the engine seemed quieter now, the tension in the air slowly dissipating. Vanessa looked out the window, watching the sun begin to dip below the clouds. It cast a golden glow across the sky, reminding her of the possibilities that lay ahead. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a rare moment of peace. The journey wasn't over, far from it. But as the plane soared toward its destination, Vanessa realized something important: she didn't need to fight for her place anymore. She had already earned it. And that realization, that truth, would change everything. Landing into a new reality. The announcement came through the cabin speakers, clear and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats, secure your belongings, and fasten your seatbelts as we prepare for our final descent into New York City." The gentle hum of the engines shifted, a subtle change signaling the plane's slow descent back to Earth. Vanessa Jackson closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply as if preparing herself for re-entry, not just into the city awaiting her, but into a world that never stopped testing her resolve. Outside her window, the clouds thinned, revealing a sprawling view of New York City, bathed in the golden hues of an early evening sunset. Skyscrapers sparkled like distant constellations. The sight always left her breathless, but today it carried new meaning. The city, much like Vanessa's life, was a contradiction, chaotic yet beautiful, relentless yet rewarding. It was a place where the strong thrived, and she had proven, time and again, that she belonged among them. But this time, something was different. This time, she felt no need to justify her existence to anyone. A conversation left open. Vanessa glanced across the aisle. Susan, the woman in 3C, sat stiffly in her seat. Her face was still flushed, though she refused to meet Vanessa's gaze. The memory of the confrontation lingered, but now it felt distant, like an echo of a storm that had already passed. For a moment, Vanessa considered saying something, acknowledging the tension or even extending a magnanimous hand, but she stopped herself. She owed Susan nothing, and truthfully, no words would fix what had happened. Susan's assumptions and biases were her burden to carry, not Vanessa's. Still, Vanessa allowed herself a quiet thought of pity for the woman. How limiting her world must be, Vanessa mused, if she believed certain spaces belonged only to certain people. With a quiet sigh, Vanessa turned her attention back to her own reality. A life she had built with sweat, sacrifice, and undeniable brilliance, a life no one could question or take from her. A change in perspective. Greg, the businessman seated beside her, shifted slightly as he closed his laptop. "You seem lost in thought again," he said, his tone light. Vanessa smiled faintly. "I guess you could say that." Greg studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing as though he wanted to ask something deeper, but wasn't sure if he should. Finally, he said, "That kind of thing, what happened earlier. Does it happen often?" Vanessa's smile faded slightly, though her voice remained calm. "More often than you'd think. Not always as overt as it was today, but it's always there, just under the surface." Greg let out a slow breath, his gaze thoughtful. "It's hard to imagine. You're clearly brilliant, clearly accomplished. I don't see how anyone could question that." Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her tone measured but kind. "That's the thing, Greg. People like me don't always get to be seen for who we are first. We're judged by what we look like or where people assume we come from. That's how prejudice works, it blinds people to everything else." Greg nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I hope you know not everyone thinks that way." "I do," Vanessa said. "But the ones who do tend to be louder." A silence settled between them, not awkward, but contemplative. Greg seemed to be processing her words, grappling with a reality that was foreign to him, but undeniable now that he had witnessed it. It wasn't a conversation Vanessa often had with strangers, but something about the moment felt necessary, like a ripple spreading from a single stone tossed into still water. "I admire you, Dr. Jackson," Greg finally said, his voice sincere. "Not just for what you do, but for how you carry yourself. I think people could learn a lot from you." Vanessa offered a genuine smile this time, the kind that came from a place of peace. "Thank you. That means a lot." The arrival. As the plane touched down with a gentle jolt, Vanessa felt a sense of finality wash over her, not just because the flight was over, but because something within her had shifted irrevocably. The old Vanessa might have carried the bitterness of the incident with her for days, replaying the words and the looks until they wore her down. But now, the weight of it had lifted. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned her, and it wouldn't be the last. But it no longer felt like her responsibility to convince anyone of her worth. As the passengers began to gather their belongings, Vanessa stayed seated, taking her time. She watched as Greg stood up, offering her a parting nod before disappearing into the aisle. Susan, on the other hand, rushed out as quickly as she could, avoiding any eye contact. Vanessa couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness for her. As the cabin emptied, the flight attendant Linda approached one last time. "Thank you for flying with us, Dr. Jackson. It was an honor to have you on board today." Vanessa smiled warmly. "Thank you, Linda. You were wonderful." Linda hesitated for a moment before adding softly, "I hope you know you're an inspiration to people like me." Vanessa's heart swelled at the words, but this time, she accepted them fully. "Thank you, Linda. That means more than you know." With that, she stood, gathered her things, and made her way off the plane. A new chapter. The air outside the terminal was cool and crisp as Vanessa stepped into the bustling New York evening. Cars honked, travelers hurried by, and the familiar hum of the city enveloped her like an old friend. As she slid into the back seat of a taxi, Vanessa took a deep breath, feeling grounded in a way she hadn't in years. The confrontation on the plane had been painful, yes, but it had also been a turning point, one that forced her to face the truth about the life she had built. For too long, Vanessa had allowed herself to believe that success alone would shield her from doubt, prejudice, and judgment. She had thought that her degrees, her skills, and her reputation would speak louder than the assumptions people made. But now she understood that true peace didn't come from external validation. It came from within. She was not just Dr. Vanessa Jackson, heart surgeon. She was Vanessa, strong, resilient, brilliant, and deserving of every space she chose to occupy. As the taxi pulled away from the airport, Vanessa's phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Marcus, you landed yet?" Vanessa smiled and typed her reply. "Yeah, I'm here. And I'm good, Marcus. Really good." A lesson learned. The world had not changed in a day. People like Susan would always exist, their minds closed to possibility and progress. But Vanessa had changed. She no longer carried the need to fight for her place, she knew she belonged. And as the lights of New York City blurred past her window, Vanessa Jackson promised herself that the next time someone questioned her, she would not see it as a challenge to her worth, but as proof of their own limitations. Because she was no longer living her life to convince others. She was living it for herself. And that, she realized, was the freedom she had been chasing all along.